The Alaskan night isn't dark. It's absolute. No stars. No moon. Just a black so heavy it feels like it's pressing down on your chest. I was on perimeter watch when I saw them. 3 lights, bright white, hanging low over the ridge. They didn't move like aircraft. Too slow. Too deliberate. They hovered there, humming soft, like the air itself was vibrating. My radio hissed static, sharp enough to sting my ears. Then, in the blink of an eye, the lights vanished. The floodlights snapped off. The whole compound went dead silent. When they came back, my watch said 40 minutes had passed, but I swear I hadn't taken a single breath. And just past the ridge, where the lights had been, the snow was glowing faint blue, like something had burned its shape into the ice. My name is Jake Kivalina, and I shouldn't be telling you this story. 3 months ago, I was washing dishes at the Northern Lights Diner in Fairbanks, splitting rent on a studio apartment that smelled like old cigarettes and regret. The military recruiter who walked in that Tuesday morning looked like salvation in a pressed uniform. Staff Sergeant Tulimak, built like a tree trunk, spoke with the kind of authority that made you forget your own doubts. "Special assignment," he said, stirring sugar into coffee that had been sitting on the burner since morning. "Remote monitoring station. Good pay, better benefits. You interested in serving your country, son?" I was interested in paying off my student loans before I turned 40. 2 weeks later, I was strapped into the back of a Chinook helicopter, watching the spruce forests of interior Alaska shrink into white nothing. The pilot, a guy named Anyu with traditional tattoos peeking out from under his collar, kept checking his instruments like they were lying to him. "First time out to Coldfoot Station?" he shouted over the rotor wash. I nodded, though Coldfoot wasn't on any map I'd seen. "Word of advice," Anyu said, his voice dropping low enough that I had to lean forward to hear. "Whatever they tell you about the protocols, follow them, every single one. My cousin Tommy got transferred there 2 years back. Came home for leave talking about shadows that moved wrong and sounds in the permafrost." The helicopter banked sharply, and through the porthole, I saw it. A cluster of prefab buildings squatting in a valley between 2 ridges, surrounded by chain link topped with razor wire. Generators hummed against the cold, powering floodlights that turned the falling snow into a constellation of white sparks. When we landed, Tommy's replacement was already waiting. Lieutenant U2 met me at the helicopter pad, her breath forming small clouds in the -30 air. She was Inupiat, probably mid-30s, with the kind of weathered face that comes from spending winters in places where the wind cuts through Kevlar like tissue paper. "Welcome to Coldfoot Station, Private Kivalina," she said, shouldering my duffel bag before I could protest. "Hope you brought your thermal underwear." The compound was larger than it looked from the air. 6 main buildings connected by covered walkways, all painted that military gray that somehow managed to look dirty even when clean. Steam rose from ventilation shafts, and the constant hum of diesel generators provided a low soundtrack to everything. Mess hall, barracks, communications, supply depot, motor pool, and the observatory. Lieutenant U2 pointed to each building as we walked. "You'll be working rotating shifts between perimeter security and atmospheric monitoring." "Atmospheric monitoring?" "Aurora activity, solar radiation, magnetic field fluctuations." She stopped at the door to the barracks, fumbling with a key ring thick with tags. "The brass calls it research. We call it Tuesday." The barracks were standard military issue. 8 bunks, 8 lockers, a communal area with a television that showed nothing but static, and a coffee machine that looked like it had survived the Korean War. 3 other soldiers were inside, playing cards at a folding table. "Rodriguez, Park, Simeone, meet your new bunkmate," Lieutenant U2 announced. Rodriguez looked up from his hand, a stocky guy with a Boston accent thick enough to spread on toast. Fresh meat. You ever work remote stations before, rookie? First assignment, I admitted. Course it is. Park, a thin Korean-American woman with sergeant stripes, shuffled the deck with practiced ease. Nobody volunteers for cold foot. We're all here because we pissed someone off. Simeone just nodded. A quiet Navajo man who looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. Dark circles under his eyes, hands that shook slightly when he reached for his coffee mug. All right, enough socializing, Lieutenant Yutu said. Kivalina, grab your gear and meet me in the communications building in 10. Time for your briefing. The communications building smelled like ozone and burned coffee. Banks of monitors covered 2 walls, displaying everything from satellite feeds to seismic readings. A third wall was covered with what looked like a maintenance checklist. But as I got closer, I realized the entries were more specific than routine upkeep. Lieutenant Yutu noticed me reading and cleared her throat. Standard operating procedures. 7 protocols that keep this station running smoothly. She pulled out a laminated card from her desk drawer. Study these. Memorize them. Your life depends on following them exactly. I took the card. The text was typed in military specification font, each line numbered. Coldfoot Station. Operational protocols. Perimeter. Watch protocol. Between 0200 to 0400 hours, maintain visual contact with assigned sector. If lights appear over the eastern ridge, do not attempt radio communication. Log time, duration, and basic description only. Generator maintenance. Check backup generators every 4 hours. If you hear metallic tapping from inside the housing, step away and wait 15 minutes before returning. Never investigate the source of the sound. Communications. Blackout. Every Wednesday at 2100 hours, all external communications shut down for 60 minutes. Remain in assigned buildings during this time. Do not use portable radios or attempt to restore connection. Equipment malfunction. Response. If seismic equipment registers readings above 6.0 while no earthquake occurs, evacuate to the mess hall. Wait for all clear signal before resuming duties. Atmospheric disturbance procedure. During aurora activity rated Class X or above, all personnel report to the observatory basement. Remain there until aurora activity drops below Class C threshold. Wildlife encounter protocol. If you encounter any animal larger than a fox within the compound perimeter, do not approach. Retreat to nearest building and file incident report immediately. Emergency evacuation. If ordered to evacuate, proceed immediately to helicopter pad. Do not stop to collect personal items. Do not look back at the compound during evacuation. Questions? Lieutenant Yutu asked. I stared at the card, my stomach twisting into knots. These seem specific. They are. Her tone carried a weight that made the hair on my neck prickle. Previous personnel learned these protocols the hard way. Some of them didn't survive the learning process. Outside, the wind howled across the valley, rattling the building's metal siding like fingers on a drum. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. Or at least, something that sounded like a coyote. Your first shift starts at 0200, Lieutenant Yutu continued. Rodriguez will show you the perimeter route. Get some sleep, Private. You'll need it. As I walked back to the barracks, the protocols card felt like it was burning through my pocket. 7 simple rules. 7 ways to stay alive in the middle of nowhere. I just wished I understood what I needed staying alive from. Hi, everyone. Before we move forward, I have something exciting to tell you. Many of you asked for stories without the strange rules, so I created a brand new channel just for that. It's called Mr. Grimm Archive. The link is in the description, or you can click the card above. I think you'll really enjoy it. So check it out whenever you want some more exciting types of stories. Also, I hope you're enjoying the 2 uploads a day. Let me know in the comments if you like some stories from your location. Now, let's continue with today's story. Rodriguez shook me awake at 01:45 hours. Time to earn your paycheck, rookie. I'd managed maybe 3 hours of sleep, plagued by dreams of blue snow and humming air. The barracks was tomb quiet except for Park's soft snoring and the constant background drone of the generators. Outside, the wind had died to a whisper, which somehow made the silence worse. Coffee, Rodriguez offered, pouring steaming black liquid from a thermos. Thanks. The coffee tasted like it had been filtered through motor oil, but the heat helped chase away the cold that seemed to live in my bones now. First patrol, Rodriguez said, pulling on his parka. I'll walk you through the routine. After tonight, you're on your own. The exterior door opened with a sharp crack, metal contracting in the frigid air. The compound looked different at night. The floodlights created islands of harsh white, separated by pools of absolute darkness. Our breath crystallized instantly, floating away like tiny ghosts. Perimeter runs clockwise, Rodriguez explained, checking his watch. Takes about 90 minutes for the full circuit. We check each sensor station, log the readings, and radio in every 30 minutes. What are we watching for? Rodriguez paused, adjusting his rifle strap. Equipment failures, mostly. Wildlife incursions. Weather changes. He started walking toward the eastern fence line. And other things. The perimeter was marked by motion sensors mounted on 12-foot posts, their red LED indicators blinking like digital fireflies. The first station showed normal readings. Temperature, wind speed, electromagnetic activity, all within normal parameters. This job used to be automated, Rodriguez said, logging the numbers on his clipboard. Sensors would report directly to the communications center, but after the Henderson incident, they decided human eyes were better. What happened to Henderson? Disappeared during a night patrol last winter. Found him 3 days later, about 2 miles past the eastern ridge. Rodriguez's voice dropped. Coroner said he'd been walking in circles for hours. Footprints in the snow showed he'd covered maybe 15 miles, just going in loops. We continued our circuit, checking sensors and logging readings. The routine was almost meditative. Walk, check, record, repeat. But every few minutes I found myself glancing toward the eastern ridge, remembering the protocols card in my pocket. Rodriguez, I said as we approached the halfway point of our patrol. Those protocols Lieutenant U2 gave me. Stop right there. His voice carried a warning that made me close my mouth instantly. Rule 1 of surviving Coldfoot Station. Never discuss the protocols unless you're actively following one. Talking about them when you don't need to. That's how accidents happen. The eastern ridge loomed against the starless sky like a sleeping giant. The sensor station here was newer than the others, its housing unmarked by weather or age. Rodriguez approached it more carefully, his movements measured and precise. This one's always been temperamental, he said, checking the display. Sometimes it picks up readings that don't make sense, magnetic signatures that shouldn't exist, heat blooms in sub-zero temperatures. The display showed normal readings, but something about the ridge ahead nagged at me. The darkness there seemed thicker, more present, like it was watching us back. Rodriguez, I whispered. Look. 3 points of light had appeared over the ridge. Not aircraft beacons. These were steady, bright white, hanging motionless about 50 feet above the tree line. They pulsed faintly, synchronized like a heartbeat. Rodriguez grabbed my arm, squeezing hard enough to bruise. Don't move! Don't talk! Don't touch your radio! The lights hung there, beautiful and wrong. My training kicked in. Identify the threat, assess the situation, take appropriate action. But these lights defied identification. They were too bright to be flares, too steady to be helicopters, too low to be aircraft. A sound started, soft at first, humming, like power lines in summer rain. It built slowly, resonating through the ground and into my chest. My radio crackled with static, harsh bursts that sounded almost like voices speaking underwater. Rodriguez pulled out his logbook, writing quickly despite the cold, making his hands shake. I wanted to ask what he was recording, but his earlier warning kept me silent. The lights continued their steady pulse, and the humming grew stronger. My watch read 0247 hours when the lights suddenly shifted, not moving exactly, but changing position instantaneously. From over the ridge to directly above us, the humming became a pressure in my skull, like standing too close to massive speakers. The floodlights around the compound flickered once, twice, then died. Complete darkness swallowed us. No stars, no moon, nothing but the 3 white lights burning above like holes in reality. My radio squealed with feedback so loud it made my ears ring. Rodriguez grabbed my shoulder, steering me toward the nearest building. The mess hall door was maybe 20 yards away, but in that darkness, it might as well have been 20 miles. I stumbled over uneven ground, Rodriguez's grip the only thing keeping me oriented. The lights followed our movement, maintaining their position directly overhead. Then, as suddenly as they'd appeared, they vanished. The floodlights snapped back to life with an electrical pop that echoed across the compound. Normal vision returned, leaving purple spots dancing in my eyes. My watch showed 0331 hours, but I could have sworn only minutes had passed. Rodriguez was still writing in his logbook, his handwriting shaky but legible. Time of first appearance, duration, number of lights, approximate altitude, he muttered. Basic description only. Never speculate about origin or nature. Rodriguez, what the hell? We don't talk about it. He cut me off. We log it, report it, and move on. That's Protocol 1. Those lights show up maybe once a month, sometimes more frequently. Nobody knows what they are, and everybody who tried to find out either disappeared or transferred out within a week. We finished the patrol in silence. The remaining sensor stations showed normal readings, as if nothing had happened. But when we passed the eastern ridge again, I noticed something that made my stomach clench. The snow there was glowing faintly blue, exactly where the lights had first appeared. Not bright, just a subtle phosphorescence, like moonlight trapped in ice crystals. When I pointed it out to Rodriguez, he just shook his head. Some things you learn not to see, he said. Some things you learn not to remember. Back at the communications center, Rodriguez filed his report with Lieutenant Yutu, who was working the night shift. She read it without expression, filed it in a cabinet that was already stuffed with similar forms, and told us to get some sleep. As we walked back to the barracks, Rodriguez stopped me at the door. Tonight was easy, he said. The lights just watched. Sometimes they do other things. Sometimes they take people for walks in the snow. Sometimes people come back from those walks different. He left me standing there, staring at the eastern ridge where blue snow still glowed in patches too perfect to be natural. I woke up to Simeone sitting on the edge of his bunk, staring at nothing. His hands were clasped so tightly, his knuckles had gone white, and he was rocking slightly back and forth. The digital clock on the wall read 0847 hours. "You okay?" I whispered, not wanting to wake the others. He looked at me like he'd forgotten other people existed. "Generator duty," he said finally. "You're taking over my rotation today." Why? Simeone stood up, moving to his locker with the careful precision of someone trying not to fall apart. I can't handle the sounds anymore. Every time I check the backup units, I hear... He stopped, shaking his head. Lieutenant U2 said you could take my shifts for a while. Park stirred in her bunk, mumbling something about keeping it down. Rodriguez was already gone, probably catching up on sleep after our night patrol. The barracks felt smaller in daylight, the walls pressing closer together. "What sounds?" I asked. But Simeone was already heading for the door, fully dressed despite the early hour. "Check the generators every 4 hours, keep the logbook updated, and remember Protocol 2. He left me sitting there, trying to shake off the lingering unease from last night. The blue snow had faded by morning, leaving no trace of the lights or the lost time. But the memory felt carved into my skull, sharp and persistent. After a breakfast of powdered eggs and coffee that could strip paint, Lieutenant U2 found me in the mess hall. "Kivalina, you're on generator maintenance today. Simeone requested a transfer to communications duty. Is he all right?" "He's been here 8 months, she said, which wasn't really an answer. That's longer than most people last at Coldfoot Station. The isolation gets to everyone eventually." The generator shed sat apart from the main compound, connected by a gravel path that someone had to clear of snow every morning. 3 massive diesel units provided primary power, with 2 smaller backup generators for emergencies. The constant rumble was so pervasive, you stopped hearing it after a while, like living next to a highway. The maintenance checklist was straightforward. Check fuel levels, oil pressure, coolant temperature, battery voltage. Log everything in a bound notebook that was thick with previous entries. Most of the handwriting belonged to different soldiers. Transfer dates marked the transitions from one set of careful notes to another. Simeone's entries from the past month were increasingly erratic. His normally neat handwriting had devolved into barely legible scrawls with multiple crossouts and corrections. Some entries were just question marks or incomplete sentences that trailed off mid-thought. The first 3 checks went normally. Fuel tanks at 80%. Oil pressure good. Batteries fully charged. The generators hummed with mechanical reliability, drowning out most other sounds. But as I approached the backup units for the 1400-hour check, I heard it. Tap, tap, tap. Metallic, rhythmic, coming from inside the housing of the secondary backup generator. I stopped walking, straining to listen over the engine noise. The tapping continued, steady as a heartbeat, like someone with a wrench working on internal components. Protocol 2 echoed in my memory. If you hear metallic tapping from inside the housing, step away and wait 15 minutes before returning. I backed away from the generator, checking my watch. 1403 hours. The tapping continued, joined by what sounded like scratching or scraping. Metal on metal, deliberate and purposeful. Someone, or something, was working inside a sealed generator housing. 15 minutes felt like an hour. I paced outside the shed, watching the second hand crawl around my watch face. The tapping stopped after about 5 minutes, but I waited the full prescribed time. When I finally returned to complete the check, everything appeared normal. Fuel levels, oil pressure, coolant temperature, all within acceptable parameters. But the housing felt warm to the touch, warmer than it should have been for a unit running in standby mode. The 1800-hour check passed without incident. Same with 2,200 hours. I was starting to think the morning's events had been a one-time occurrence when I heard footsteps on the gravel path. Park appeared in the doorway, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing an expression I couldn't read. "Thought you might want some company," she said, handing me one of the cups. thanks. The coffee was actually decent, probably from her personal stash rather than the communal pot. Simeone told me about the sounds, she said, settling onto a stack of supply crates. He's been hearing them for weeks, started affecting his sleep, his appetite. Lieutenant Yutu finally agreed to reassign him. What do you think causes them? Park was quiet for a long moment, staring at the generators. My grandmother was Korean War Navy. She served on a destroyer that got damaged in a storm. Hull breach, flooding in the engine room. 3 sailors died trying to keep the engines running long enough to reach port. I waited for her to continue. She said for years afterward, on quiet nights, she could still hear them working. Tools hitting metal. Voices calling out orders. The sounds of men who died doing their jobs, still trying to finish what they started. You think the generators are haunted? I think this whole place is haunted, Park said simply. Not by ghosts exactly, but by echoes, remnants of things that happened here before we arrived. The 200-hour check arrived too quickly. Park had left around midnight, and I was alone again with the mechanical symphony of the generators. I approached the backup units with growing dread, every shadow seeming to hide watching eyes. The tapping started before I even reached the secondary unit. Louder this time, more urgent. Not just metal on metal, but scraping, grinding, like someone trying to claw their way out from inside the housing. The sound made my teeth ache and my skin crawl. I stepped back immediately, but the tapping followed me. Now it was coming from the primary generators too, a chorus of metallic percussion that rose above the engine noise. Tap, 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 scrape, grind, tap, tap, tap. Multiple sources, multiple rhythms, like an orchestra of trapped mechanics. My radio crackled to life. Generator station, this is communications. Report status. Lieutenant Yutu's voice cut through the metallic symphony. I keyed the mic with trembling fingers. Generator station reporting normal operations. All units running within parameters. Copy that. Continue standard maintenance schedule. The radio went quiet, leaving me alone with the sounds. I waited the prescribed 15 minutes, but the tapping didn't stop. If anything, it grew more frantic, more desperate. By the time I finally approached the generators again, my hands were shaking so badly, I could barely hold the logbook. Everything checked out normal. Fuel, oil, coolant, batteries, perfect across the board. But the housing on the secondary backup was burning hot enough that I jerked my hand back when I touched it. The metal felt alive, vibrating with more than just engine harmonics. I logged the readings and got out of there as fast as I could without running. Back in the barracks, Simeone was awake, sitting in the dark by the window. He looked at me when I came in, recognition flickering in his eyes. "You heard them," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, not trusting my voice. "I used to think they were trying to communicate," Simeone continued. "Some kind of message tapped out in code. But I was wrong. They're not trying to talk to us." "What are they trying to do?" Simeone turned back to the window, where the first hint of dawn was painting the eastern ridge, pale gray. "They're trying to get out." I climbed into my bunk with my clothes still on, but sleep wouldn't come. Outside, the generators continued their constant humming, and underneath that sound, or maybe just in my imagination, I could still hear the tapping. Persistent, patient, determined. Like something counting down to 0. Wednesday arrived like a funeral. The sky hung low and gray, spitting ice crystals that stung exposed skin. I'd been at Coldfoot Station for 5 days, and the routine was starting to feel normal, if you could call anything about this place normal. Rodriguez found me in the supply depot. checking inventory on MREs and medical supplies. "First communications blackout tonight," he said, not looking up from his clipboard. "You ready for that?" What exactly happens during the blackout? All external communications shut down at 2100 hours sharp. No radio contact with headquarters, no satellite uplinks, no internet. We're completely cut off for 60 minutes. He paused, finally meeting my eyes. And we stay inside our assigned buildings. No exceptions. Why? Rodriguez shrugged, but the gesture looked forced. Orders from above. Some kind of maintenance window for the satellite network. Or so they tell us. That evening, dinner felt different. The mess hall buzzed with nervous energy, conversations starting and stopping abruptly. Park pushed her food around her tray without eating much. Simeone didn't show up at all, which wasn't unusual lately. Lieutenant U2 made the rounds, checking on everyone like a mother hen counting her chicks. At 21:55 hours, she stood up and cleared her throat. Blackout begins in 5 minutes. Everyone knows their assignments. Rodriguez and Kivalina in the barracks, Park and Simeone in communications. Maintenance crew stays in the motor pool. Nobody leaves their building until the all-clear signal. "What's the all-clear signal?" I asked. "3 short blasts on the compound horn," Lieutenant U2 said. "If you don't hear it by 2200 hours, stay put until morning." Rodriguez and I walked back to the barracks together, the frozen air making our breath visible in white puffs. The compound felt different at night, like it was holding its breath. Even the ever-present generator noise seemed muted. "Rodriguez," I said as we reached the barracks door. "What aren't you telling me about these blackouts?" He stopped with his hand on the doorknob. "You really want to know?" I nodded. Last winter, Private Chen decided Protocol 3 was stupid. Figured he'd take a quick walk to the communications building during blackout, check on his girlfriend back in Seattle. Found him the next morning frozen to death about halfway between buildings. Rodriguez's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Thing is, he'd been walking in circles for hours. His tracks went round and round the same patch of ground, like he'd gotten lost in his own backyard. At exactly 2100 hours, the lights in the barracks flickered and went out. Emergency lighting kicked in, casting everything in a dull red glow that made shadows stretch and twist. The steady hum of the communications array died, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt physical. Rodriguez settled into his bunk with a paperback novel, using a small LED flashlight to read. I tried to do the same, but concentration was a lost cause. The silence outside was wrong, too thick, too perfect. Even in the middle of Alaska, there should be wind sounds, settling noises, something. 20 minutes into the blackout, I heard footsteps on the gravel outside. Slow, measured steps circling the building. Not the sharp crunch of boots on frozen ground, but something softer, like bare feet on snow. Rodriguez looked up from his book, finger marking his place. "You hear that?" I whispered. He nodded, closing the book carefully. "Stay quiet. Don't look out the windows." The footsteps continued their circuit of the building. 3 times around clockwise, then 3 times counterclockwise. Each lap took exactly the same amount of time, like whatever was walking had found the perfect rhythm and refused to deviate from it. On the 4th counterclockwise circuit, the footsteps stopped directly outside our window. The silence that followed was worse than the walking. Rodriguez gripped his flashlight like a weapon, knuckles white against the black plastic. My mouth had gone completely dry, and I realized I was holding my breath. A sound started outside. Soft at first, like someone humming a lullaby. But as it grew louder, I realized it wasn't human. The pitch was wrong. Too high and too low at the same time, harmonizing with itself in ways that made my teeth ache. It sounded like a chorus of children singing underwater, their voices distorted by depth and distance. The humming stopped abruptly, replaced by 3 soft taps on the window glass. Rodriguez grabbed my arm, squeezing hard enough to leave bruises. "Don't answer," he mouthed silently. "Don't move." 3 more taps, slightly louder. Then 3 more, each series more insistent than the last. Whatever was outside wanted attention, wanted acknowledgement, wanted to be let in from the cold. The tapping moved from window to window, a patient exploration of every possible entry point. When it reached the door, the handle rattled softly, testing the lock. The sound was almost gentle, like a friend checking to see if you were home. My radio crackled to life despite the communications blackout, static bursting from the speaker in sharp, painful stabs. Through the white noise, I could hear something that might have been a voice, distorted, pleading, speaking words in a language I didn't recognize. Rodriguez leaned close to my ear, his breath warm against my skin. "Sometimes they try to imitate voices," he whispered. "People you know, people you miss. Don't listen to what it says." The radio static grew louder, more urgent. Now I could make out individual words, fragments of sentences that sounded almost familiar. My name, spoken in a voice that sounded like my mother's. Pleas for help, promises that everything would be okay if I just opened the door. The handle rattled again, more forcefully this time. Something scraped against the metal door frame, like fingernails on blackboard. Long, deliberate scratches that spoke of patience and determination. Then, as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. No footsteps, no humming, no voice on the radio pleading for entry. The compound returned to its previous silence, but now that silence felt different. Watchful, waiting. Rodriguez checked his watch. 21:47 hours, still 13 minutes left in the blackout. "Is it gone?" I whispered. "They never really leave," Rodriguez said. "They just stop trying so hard." The remaining minutes crawled by like hours. Every small sound made me flinch. The building settling in the cold, Rodriguez turning a page, my own heartbeat loud in my ears. When the compound horn finally sounded 3 sharp blasts at exactly 2200 hours, the relief was overwhelming. The regular lights flickered back on, and the communications array resumed its steady electronic hum. Through the window, I could see the other buildings lighting up as well, normal life resuming after the hour of enforced isolation. "That was your first blackout," Rodriguez said, marking his place in the book with a torn piece of paper. "They get easier after a while. You learn to tune out the sounds." "What are they?" "Wish I knew." He stretched, working out the tension in his shoulders. "Lieutenant U2 says the blackouts are for satellite maintenance, but satellites don't require people to hide indoors. My theory? Something about the communication systems attracts them. When we power everything down, they come looking for the signals." I walked to the window, peering out at the compound. Everything looked normal. Floodlights casting their usual harsh white glow, snow falling in lazy spirals, the other buildings solid and reassuring. But there, in the fresh snow beside our building, I could see the tracks. Circular patterns, like someone had walked around and around the barracks. But the prints weren't quite right. Too long, too narrow, with what looked like claw marks at the front of each impression. "Rodriguez," I called softly. "Come look at this." He joined me at the window, following my gaze to the tracks in the snow. His face went pale under the harsh lighting. "Those weren't there before the blackout," he said. "What made them?" Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, studying the strange footprints that circled our building like a predator marking territory. Something that walks on two legs, he said finally, but something that isn't human. The wolf appeared on Friday morning, standing just inside the perimeter fence like it owned the place. I was checking the eastern sensor array when I spotted it. A massive gray and white animal, easily 120 pounds, positioned near the communications building. It wasn't moving, wasn't hunting or scavenging, just standing there watching me with yellow eyes that caught the morning light like polished brass. My first instinct was to reach for my radio, but Protocol 6 echoed in my memory. If you encounter any animal larger than a fox within the compound perimeter, do not approach. Retreat to nearest building and file incident report immediately. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the wolf. It tracked my movement with its head, ears forward and alert, but showed no signs of aggression. No hackles raised, no bared teeth, no predatory crouch. If anything, it looked curious, almost thoughtful. The supply depot was closest, maybe 30 yards behind me. I covered half that distance before the wolf did something that made my blood turn to slush. It smiled. Not a dog's panting expression or a snarl showing teeth. A human smile, lips pulling back to reveal canines that were too white, too perfect, arranged in a mouth that was wrong for a wolf's skull. The expression was knowing, amused, like it had just heard a private joke at my expense. I ran. The supply depot door slammed behind me with a bang that echoed through the building. My hands shook as I fumbled for the radio, merely dropping it twice before managing to key the microphone. Communications, this is Kivalina at Supply Depot. We have a wildlife situation. Large wolf inside the compound perimeter, eastern sector. Lieutenant U2's voice crackled back immediately. Copy that, Kivalina. Remain in the building. Do not attempt to approach or engage. We're sending a response team. Through the depot's single window, I could see the wolf hadn't moved. It stood in the exact same position, yellow eyes fixed on the supply depot, like it knew exactly where I was hiding. The smile had faded, but something about its posture suggested it was still amused by the situation. Rodriguez arrived 10 minutes later, accompanied by Park and 2 soldiers I didn't recognize, mountain warfare specialists from the look of their gear. They approached the wolf in a wide formation, weapons ready but not aimed directly at the animal. The wolf watched them come, head tilted slightly to one side. When Rodriguez got within 20 feet, it sat down like a well-trained dog waiting for a command. The casual gesture was somehow more unsettling than aggressive behavior would have been. Easy there, Rodriguez called out, voice steady and calm. Nobody wants to hurt you. Just need you to move along. Find somewhere else to be. The wolf's ears perked up, and it turned its head toward Rodriguez with what looked like interest. Then it opened its mouth and spoke. Hello, Rodriguez. The voice was perfectly human. Male, middle-aged, with a slight accent I couldn't place. It came from the wolf's throat, but the mouth movements didn't match the words. Like watching a badly dubbed movie where the audio track was running ahead of the video. Rodriguez froze, rifle halfway to his shoulder. Park swore under her breath, and the 2 specialists backed away instinctively. The wolf's yellow eyes moved from person to person, cataloging their reactions with obvious satisfaction. Surprised? The wolf continued, its voice warm and conversational. You shouldn't be. This place has always attracted visitors. Some of us have been watching your little compound for quite some time. What are you? Park demanded, her weapon now trained directly on the animal. The wolf's attention shifted to her, and that human smile returned. I'm disappointed, Park. Your grandmother would have recognized what I am immediately. Korean folklore is rich with stories of creatures like me. Park's face went white. How do you know about my grandmother? I I know many things. I know Simeone hasn't slept more than 2 hours at a time in weeks. I know Rodriguez still has nightmares about Henderson. I know Jake Kivalina here is wondering if his student loans were worth ending up in this frozen hell. The wolf stood up, stretching like a dog waking from a nap. But the movement was too fluid, too controlled, muscles flowing under the pelt in ways that defied anatomy. I know the generators aren't just making noise, it continued, yellow eyes finding mine through the depot window. I know the Wednesday visitors aren't just looking for communication signals. I know the lights over the eastern ridge aren't just atmospheric phenomena. "What do you want?" Rodriguez asked, his voice steady despite the rifle trembling in his hands. "Want?" The wolf laughed, a sound that was pure human amusement coming from an animal throat. "I don't want anything. I'm here because this place calls to things like me. Your little experiments, your monitoring equipment, your attempts to understand forces you can barely comprehend. It all sends out signals that travel much farther than you realize." The wolf began walking toward the eastern fence line, moving with a predator's casual confidence. "But I'm not the real problem here. I'm just a scout, you might say. Testing the waters, seeing how your kind responds to contact." It paused at the fence, looking back over its shoulder. "The others are less conversational. When they arrive, you'll want to remember your protocols. All of them. Exactly as written." "When?" Lieutenant U2's voice carried across the compound. She'd appeared from the communications building, armed and alert. "Soon," the wolf replied. "Very soon. The barriers between worlds are thinning, and this place sits right at the confluence of several very interesting dimensional fractures. You've been monitoring atmospheric disturbances for months without realizing you're measuring the symptoms, not the cause." With casual ease, the wolf leaped over the 8-foot chain-link fence topped with razor wire. The jump was effortless, physics-defying, like gravity was optional for this particular creature. It landed in the snow beyond the perimeter and immediately began changing. The transformation was stomach-churning. Bones cracked and reshaped with wet, grinding sounds. The wolf's pelt rippled and flowed like liquid, reforming into human clothing. Within seconds, a man in military fatigues stood where the wolf had been, tall, lean, with the same yellow eyes and knowing smile. "See you around the compound," he called out, voice carrying easily across the distance. Then he walked into the tree line and vanished, leaving behind only human footprints in the snow. The response team stood in the stunned silence for several minutes. Finally, Rodriguez lowered his rifle and keyed his radio. "All clear. Target has left the compound perimeter." I emerged from the supply depot on shaking legs, joining the group near where the wolf had stood. The snow was trampled from multiple sets of boots, but underneath I could make out the wolf's paw prints, until they abruptly stopped and were replaced by human tracks leading to the fence. "That was a skinwalker," Park said quietly, her voice carrying a weight of ancestral knowledge. "My grandmother told me stories, but they're real." Lieutenant U2 approached, holstering her sidearm with practiced precision. Whatever it was, it knew too much about this facility and our personnel. "I'm filing a Priority 1 incident report with headquarters." "Good luck getting anyone to believe it," Rodriguez muttered. "Doesn't matter if they believe it," Lieutenant U2 replied. "What matters is following protocol. Everyone did exactly what they were supposed to do, and nobody got hurt. That's the important part." But as we walked back to our respective duties, I couldn't shake the creature's words. "The others are less conversational." What others? How many of these things were watching us? And what did it mean about dimensional fractures and atmospheric disturbances being symptoms rather than causes? That afternoon, while updating the supply inventory, I found myself checking the window every few minutes. The eastern ridge looked the same as always, snow-covered pines stretching up toward a gray sky. But now I knew something was watching from those shadows, something that could wear any face it chose, speak with any voice, walk through our world wearing shapes that were almost human, but not quite right. The wolf's human smile haunted my thoughts. Too perfect, too knowing, too amused by secrets we couldn't begin to understand. And its casual mention of others coming soon made my skin crawl with anticipation. Protocol 6 had worked exactly as intended. We'd identified the threat, maintained safe distance, and survived the encounter without casualties. But for the first time since arriving at Coldfoot Station, I wondered if survival was just a temporary condition. The protocols weren't just keeping us safe from random supernatural events. They were keeping us alive in the middle of something much larger and more organized than I'd imagined. Something that was studying us as carefully as we were studying the atmospheric phenomena. Something that was preparing for a bigger, less conversational visit. That night, as I settled into my bunk, I could hear Simeone pacing in the darkness. Park was reading by flashlight, but I noticed her hand never moved far from the knife she kept on her nightstand. Rodriguez pretended to sleep, but his breathing was too controlled, too aware. Outside, the generators hummed their mechanical lullaby, and somewhere beyond the fence line, yellow eyes watched our windows with patient, predatory intelligence. The seismic equipment started screaming at 03:47 hours Sunday morning. I was on communications duty, monitoring the overnight feeds from headquarters when every alarm in the building went off simultaneously. Red lights flashed across the control panels, and the printer began spitting out data sheets faster than I could catch them. The primary seismograph showed readings that made no sense. Magnitude 7.2, then 8.1, then a spike that pushed the needle past the maximum scale. But I wasn't feeling any earthquake motion. The building sat perfectly still, coffee in my mug undisturbed, pencils lying flat on the desk. Protocol 4 burned in my memory. If seismic equipment registers readings above 6.0, while no earthquake occurs, evacuate to the mess hall. I grabbed the emergency radio and started broadcasting on all frequencies. All personnel, this is communications. We have a Code 4 situation. Repeat, Code 4. All personnel report to mess hall immediately. The response was instant. Rodriguez's voice crackled back first. Communications, this is perimeter patrol. Confirming Code 4. En route to mess hall. Park answered from the motor pool. Copy Code 4. Moving to mess hall now. Lieutenant U2 was already running across the compound when I stepped outside, her boots crunching on fresh snow. The night air felt electric, charged with an energy that made my skin tingle and my hair stand on end. "What triggered the alarm?" she called out as we jogged toward the mess hall. "Seismic readings above 8.0, but no ground movement," I replied. "Equipment says we're in the middle of a major earthquake, but we're not," she finished. "That's happened twice before in the past year. Both times preceded significant atmospheric events." The mess hall felt different at night, shadows stretching longer between the overhead fixtures. The other personnel arrived within minutes. Rodriguez from his patrol route, Park from the motor pool. Even Simeone emerged from whatever dark corner he'd been hiding in lately. "Everyone accounted for?" Lieutenant U2 asked, checking her roster. "All present," Rodriguez confirmed. "What's the situation?" Lieutenant U2 pulled out a handheld device I'd never seen before, something that looked like a cross between a Geiger counter and a smartphone, covered in military-grade protective casing. "Dimensional displacement monitor," she explained, noting my stare. "Measures fluctuations in local space-time." "Since when do we monitor space-time?" Park asked. "Since the brass finally admitted what this facility actually does," Lieutenant U2 replied, studying the device's display. Coldfoot Station isn't just monitoring atmospheric phenomena. We're sitting on top of what the scientists call a dimensional weak point, a place where the barriers between worlds are naturally thin. The device in her hands began beeping faster, the display showing cascading numbers that meant nothing to me but clearly worried her. "The seismic equipment isn't detecting earthquakes. It's detecting reality fractures. Tears in the fabric of space that register as vibrations." Outside, the wind began to howl with a sound I'd never heard before. Not the usual Arctic gale, but something that seemed to come from multiple directions at once, harmonizing with itself in ways that made my teeth ache. "How long do we stay here?" Simeone asked. His voice was steadier than it had been in days, as if having a clear protocol to follow gave him something solid to hold on to. "Until the readings drop below Class C threshold," Lieutenant U2 said, checking her device again. "Could be minutes, could be hours." The lights in the mess hall flickered once, twice, then died completely. Emergency backup power kicked in, bathing everything in that familiar red glow that made shadows writhe like living things. Through the windows, I could see the entire compound going dark, only the essential systems maintaining power. "That's not standard power management," Rodriguez said, moving to the window. "Something's drawing massive amounts of electricity from the grid." The dimensional monitor in Lieutenant U2's hands was beeping continuously now, a high-pitched whine that cut through the howling wind. "Displacement event in progress," she announced. "Everyone stay calm and maintain position." That's when we heard the voices. They started soft, like distant conversation carried on the wind. Multiple speakers, men and women talking in overlapping sentences that gradually became clearer. But the words weren't quite right. English syllables arranged in patterns that sounded like language but carried no meaning. "Previous shift personnel," Park whispered, recognition dawning in her voice. "Those sound like the soldiers who were stationed here before us." The voices grew louder, more distinct. I could make out individual speakers now, a woman with a slight southern accent, a man who sounded like he was from New York, others with regional inflections from across the country. They were having conversations, asking questions, giving reports. But the context was wrong, disconnected. "Henderson was part of the previous rotation," Rodriguez said quietly. "That's his voice, third from the left." Through the mess hall windows, figures began to appear in the compound, translucent at first, like heat mirages, but gradually becoming more solid and defined. Men and women in military fatigues, carrying equipment, performing duties that had been done months or years ago. They moved through the buildings without opening doors, walked patrol routes that overlapped with current structures, operated equipment that had been replaced or moved since their time here. Those soldiers going through the motions of their assignments, unaware that their shifts had ended long ago. "Temporal echo event," Lieutenant U2 explained, her voice tight with concentration. "The dimensional fractures are bleeding through time as well as space. We're seeing imprints of previous personnel, their activities burned into the local reality." One of the ghost soldiers walked directly through the mess hall wall, a woman in her 30s with sergeant stripes and a face I recognized from old personnel photos in Lieutenant U2's office. She moved to where the coffee station had been located in a previous layout, went through the motions of filling a cup, then turned and walked back out through the solid wall. "Sarah Anaktavuk," Lieutenant U2 said softly. "Transferred out 8 months ago after reporting severe nightmares and paranoid episodes." The seismic readings continued climbing according to the dimensional monitor. Outside, more ghost soldiers appeared, their translucent forms gradually becoming more solid, more present. They were starting to notice their surroundings, looking around with confusion as they realized the compound layout didn't match their memories. "What happens if they become fully solid?" I asked. "We don't know," Lieutenant U2 admitted. "This is the strongest displacement event on record. Previous incidents only lasted a few minutes and never reached full manifestation." One of the ghost soldiers, Henderson, based on Rodriguez's identification, stopped directly in front of the mess hall windows. He pressed his face against the glass, eyes wide with recognition and terror. His mouth moved frantically, trying to communicate something urgent. Rodriguez stepped toward the window, but Lieutenant U2 grabbed his arm. "Don't interact with them. Any contact could anchor them permanently to this timeline." Henderson's ghost pounded on the window, leaving no marks on the glass, but creating sounds we could all hear clearly. He was shouting now, warning us about something, pointing frantically toward the eastern ridge. Through the cacophony of displaced voices and howling wind, a new sound emerged, low, rhythmic, coming from the direction Henderson was pointing, the steady beat of helicopters approaching through the storm. "Evacuation protocols," Lieutenant U2 said immediately. "Everyone to the helicopter pad. Move fast, move quiet, don't look back." But as we prepared to leave the mess hall, Henderson's ghost stepped directly through the window into the building. His form was solid now, completely present, looking as real as any living person. The temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees in seconds. "Don't go to the pad," he said, his voice carrying the hollow echo of speaking from inside a cave. "They're not here to evacuate you. They're here for the data, for the dimensional readings. They'll eliminate any witnesses to maintain operational security." "Who?" Lieutenant U2 demanded. "The people who really run this place," Henderson replied. "The ones who sent you here knowing what you'd encounter. This facility doesn't monitor dimensional fractures. It creates them. Every protocol you've followed, every supernatural event you've survived, it's all been planned, documented, analyzed." The helicopter rotors were getting closer, their sound mixing with the dimensional storm into a symphony of mechanical and supernatural noise. Through the windows, I could see lights approaching from the north, multiple aircraft moving in formation. "The protocols aren't keeping you safe," Henderson continued, his ghost form flickering like bad reception. "They're keeping you alive long enough to gather complete data sets. Maximum exposure to dimensional entities while maintaining minimal personnel losses." "That's why the rotations are so short," Park realized. "They cycle people through before the psychological damage becomes permanent." "Or before they figure out the truth," Henderson added. "But something's changed. The displacement events are getting stronger, more frequent. The barriers are failing faster than anticipated." The helicopters were directly overhead now, the compound floodlights snapping back to life with their arrival. Through the mess hall windows, I could see soldiers rappelling down, but their equipment was wrong. Too advanced, too sleek. Nothing like standard military issue. "Time to go," Lieutenant U2 said grimly. "Out the back, through the supply depot, stay low." As we moved toward the rear exit, Henderson's ghost caught my arm. His touch felt like ice water flowing through my veins. "The eastern ridge," he whispered urgently. "There's a cave system. Follow the blue snow. That's where the real dimensional fracture is located. That's where you'll find the answers." Then he faded away, leaving only the echo of his warning and the approaching sound of boots on frozen ground. We slipped out the mess hall's rear exit as boots thundered across the main compound. The extraction team moved with clinical efficiency, sweeping building by building. their advanced tactical gear glinting under the floodlights. Whatever agency they represented, it wasn't regular military. "This way," Lieutenant U2 whispered, leading us toward the supply depot. "We can reach the eastern perimeter through the maintenance tunnels." The tunnels were narrow, barely wide enough for single file, connecting the major buildings through underground conduits that protected power and communication lines from the Arctic weather. Emergency lighting cast everything in harsh white, our shadows dancing across concrete walls as we moved. "How long have you known?" Rodriguez asked Lieutenant U2 as we crawled through the passage leading toward the eastern fence. "Suspected for months," she replied, her voice echoing off the tunnel walls. "Too many coincidences, too many convenient explanations for things that didn't make sense. But I couldn't prove anything until tonight." We emerged from the tunnel system at the motor pool, now abandoned and dark. Through the building's windows, I could see the extraction team had reached the communications center, their movements coordinated and purposeful. They weren't searching for survivors, they were collecting data. "Equipment," Park said, gathering supplies from the motor pool's emergency cache. "Cold weather gear, survival rations, first aid." She handed each of us a thermal pack and emergency radio. "If we're heading into the wilderness, we'll need these." Simeone had been quiet during our escape, but now he spoke up. "I've seen the blue snow before, during my generator checks, late at night when the aurora activity spikes. It leads up the eastern ridge, following what looks like an old game trail." "Henderson said there's a cave system," I reminded them. "That's where the real dimensional fracture is located." Lieutenant U2 checked her dimensional monitor, which was still beeping frantically. "Displacement readings are off the charts. Whatever's up there, it's the source of everything we've experienced." We slipped out the motor pool service door, staying low and moving quickly toward the eastern fence. The extraction team's helicopters circled overhead, their searchlights sweeping the compound in systematic patterns. But they seemed focused on the buildings, not the perimeter. The fence was easier to breach than expected. The chain link had been damaged in several places, probably by previous personnel who'd figured out the truth and attempted their own escapes. We squeezed through a gap near the eastern corner, emerging into the forest beyond. The blue snow was immediately visible, patches of phosphorescent ice scattered along what did indeed look like an old animal trail. The glow was stronger now, pulsing gently like a heartbeat, leading us up the ridge through stands of black spruce and birch. "It's getting warmer," Park observed after we'd climbed for 20 minutes. "The temperature should be dropping as we gain elevation, but it feels like spring up here." She was right. Despite the sub-zero night, the air around the blue snow felt temperate, almost tropical. Steam rose from the glowing patches, and the forest around us showed signs of impossible growth. Leaves on branches that should have been dormant. Flowers blooming in the middle of an Alaskan winter. "Dimensional bleed-through," Lieutenant U2 explained, consulting her monitor. "Reality fractures don't just connect different spaces. They can connect different times, different seasons, different physical laws." The trail wound upward through increasingly surreal landscape. Trees grew in spirals, their bark flowing like liquid. Snow fell upward in some areas, drifting toward the canopy instead of the ground. A stream ran alongside the path, its water glowing the same blue as the snow, flowing silently despite its rapid current. "There," Simeone pointed ahead to where the trail disappeared into what looked like a crack in the ridge face. The cave entrance. The opening was narrow, barely wide enough for a person, but the blue glow emanated from deep within. As we approached, I could hear something from inside, not the mechanical tapping from the generators, but something organic. Breathing, maybe. or the sound of a massive heart beating slowly and steadily. "Thermal signatures," Rodriguez reported, checking the handheld scanner Park had grabbed from the motor pool. "Multiple heat sources inside, but the readings are inconsistent. Some register as human body temperature, others are much hotter, and a few show up as absolute zero." Lieutenant U2's dimensional monitor began screaming as we entered the cave. The sound echoed off stone walls covered in the same blue phosphorescence, creating a symphony of electronic alerts that made conversation difficult. The cave system opened into a vast underground chamber, easily the size of a cathedral. The walls were covered in crystalline formations that pulsed with inner light, and the air hummed with energy that made my skin tingle. But it was what occupied the center of the chamber that made us all stop walking. A massive structure hung suspended in the air, part machine, part organic growth, part something else entirely. Cables and tubes connected it to various points around the chamber, feeding it power from sources I couldn't identify. The structure pulsed with the same rhythm as the breathing sound, and within its translucent sections, I could see shapes moving. "What is that thing?" Park whispered. "Dimensional anchor," Lieutenant U2 said, reading from her monitor's display. "It's artificially stabilizing a rift between realities, keeping the fracture open and controlled." Around the chamber, I could see evidence of long-term habitation, equipment caches, communication arrays, living quarters carved into the rock walls. This wasn't a natural phenomenon. It was an installation, maintained and operated by human hands. "How long has this been here?" Rodriguez asked. A voice answered from the shadows. 73 years, 4 months, 16 days. We spun toward the sound, weapons raised, to see a figure emerging from an alcove in the cave wall. An elderly man in military fatigues that looked like they'd been issued during World War II, moving with the careful precision of someone who'd been living underground for decades. "Colonel Mathan on you," he introduced himself, the same last name as the helicopter pilot who'd brought me to Coldfoot Station. "I was part of the original research team that discovered this dimensional fracture in 1951. "You've been down here for 70 years, Park asked in disbelief. "Time moves differently around the anchor," Colonel Anyu explained. "What feels like decades to me might be minutes in your world, or centuries. The fracture doesn't just connect different spaces. It creates temporal loops, recursive experiences, that can trap consciousness in feedback patterns." He gestured toward the massive structure. "We built the anchor to study the phenomenon, to understand what lay beyond the fracture. But something went wrong. The anchor didn't just stabilize the rift, it began expanding it, drawing energy from other dimensions to fuel its own growth. The supernatural encounters at the base, I realized, the lights, the entities, the temporal echoes, they're all spillover from whatever's on the other side." "Exactly," Colonel Anyu confirmed. "The anchor acts as a beacon, attracting entities from parallel realities. Some are merely curious, like your skinwalker friend. Others are predatory, feeding on the dimensional energy that leaks through the fracture." Inside the suspended structure, the shapes were moving more actively now, pressing against the translucent walls, like things trying to break free from chrysalids. With growing horror, I realized they weren't just shapes. They were people. Dozens of human figures suspended in some kind of fluid, connected to the anchor by umbilical-like tubes. "Previous personnel from Coldfoot Station," Colonel Anyu said, noticing my stare. "The anchor requires human consciousness to function properly. Each person exposed to the dimensional phenomena becomes partially connected to the fracture. When a psychological stress reaches critical levels, the anchor draws them in completely. That's why the rotations are short," Lieutenant U2 said grimly. They cycle people through before they become permanently connected. But something's accelerated the process recently, Colonel Anyu continued. The anchor is drawing more energy, expanding faster. It needs more consciousness to maintain stability. A new sound echoed through the chamber, boots on stone, moving toward the cave entrance. The extraction team had followed our trail. They're not here to eliminate witnesses, Colonel Anyu said quietly. They're here to collect the next batch of test subjects. The anchor is hungry, and Coldfoot Station has provided exactly the kind of consciousness it craves. Military personnel conditioned to follow orders, even when those orders lead to their destruction. The dimensional monitor in Lieutenant U2's hands went silent. According to its display, we were now standing at the exact center of a massive reality fracture, a wound in space-time that was growing larger with each passing moment. And somewhere in the darkness behind us, I could hear the extraction team getting closer. The extraction team found Rodriguez first. His screams echoed through the cave system as they dragged him toward the dimensional anchor, its organic surfaces pulsing with anticipation. Colonel Anyu tried to intervene, but 7 decades underground had left him frail. No match for soldiers in tactical gear. "Run," Lieutenant U2 whispered, pushing Park and me toward a narrow passage that led deeper into the cave system. "Find another way out. Tell people what you've seen here." Simeone grabbed my arm as we squeezed through the opening. "The protocols," he said urgently. "They're not safety measures. They're conditioning exercises, teaching us to accept the impossible, to follow orders without question, to become compliant test subjects." The passage wound through solid rock for what felt like miles, our emergency flashlights casting wild shadows on walls that seemed to breathe with their own rhythm. Behind us, more screams echoed through the stone, Park sobbing Lieutenant U2's name, then nothing. We emerged from the cave system on the north face of the ridge, miles from Coldfoot Station. The helicopters were still circling the compound, searchlights sweeping back and forth. But up here, in the thin air above the tree line, we were invisible. "We have to get to Fairbanks," I told Simeone. "Contact the media, the FBI, somebody who'll listen." He was staring back toward the cave entrance, where blue light still leaked from the cracks in the rock. "They won't believe us. And even if they do, what makes you think this is the only facility? How many other remote stations are running similar experiments?" The thought hit me like ice water. How many soldiers had been cycled through programs like this? How many had disappeared into dimensional fractures, their consciousness feeding alien machines hidden in the wilderness? Simeone and I made it to the park's highway by dawn, flagging down a trucker hauling supplies to Dead Horse. The driver, a weathered Athabascan man named Joe, took one look at our condition and asked no questions, just gave us coffee and let us ride in silence. In Fairbanks, I tried to file reports with every agency I could find. Military police, FBI field office, even the local newspaper. They all listened politely, took notes, and promised to investigate. But somehow, my service records showed I'd been honorably discharged due to psychological stress. Simeone's showed the same thing. Official channels were blocked. Unofficial ones led to dead ends or people who suddenly became unavailable for comment. The trucker Joe who'd given us a ride? No record of anyone by that name working the Dalton Highway. I'm writing this account from a studio apartment in Anchorage, the same kind of place I was trying to escape when I enlisted. My student loans are mysteriously paid in full, a clerical error, according to the bank. But I know better. Someone wants me comfortable, quiet, grateful for small mercies. Simeone lasted 2 weeks before the nightmares drove him to check himself into a psychiatric facility. He sends me postcards sometimes, pictures of serene mountain lakes, and cheerful messages about his recovery. but the handwriting isn't quite right, and he signs them with a name that isn't his. I still dream about the dimensional anchor, that pulsing organic machine feeding on human consciousness. Sometimes I wake up with blue phosphorescence under my fingernails, though I live nowhere near snow. Sometimes my radio picks up voices speaking in languages that don't exist, reporting status updates from facilities that aren't on any map. The worst part is the certainty that they're still out there. More stations, more protocols, more soldiers being conditioned to accept orders that lead to their destruction. And somewhere in a cave system beneath the Alaskan wilderness, Rodriguez Park and Lieutenant U2 are suspended in translucent fluid, their consciousness feeding a machine that tears holes in reality itself. I keep telling myself, I escaped. But some nights, when the aurora borealis dances across the Anchorage sky, I hear the dimensional anchor calling my name.